Good morning, and welcome to the 2019 Conference on Poverty and Inequality. It's wonderful to see, okay, some smattering of applause, thanks, okay. It's wonderful to see you all here, and we're excited to kick off a day full of discussion and engagement with issues of poverty and inequality in the United States. My name is Jackson Wright, and I am a student at the Kennedy School and one of the co-chairs of the conference.
My name is Maya Keel, and I recently graduated from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the conference.
This conference would not be happening today without the countless hours of hard work and leadership from the conference planning team of around 40 graduate students from across Harvard schools. Just want to take a moment to recognize them. Thank you. I also want to note some changes to the program. So as you can see, keynote speaker Philip Alston will be moderating the plenary session, and Kristen Clark is no longer able to join us, but we're excited to announce that Julie Hook, the Managing Counsel for Election Protection with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, is joining the Fighting for Voting Rights representation from courtrooms to the ballot box in Kristen's stead. Another note is that throughout the day, we're hoping that you can engage with us on social media. You can see the hashtag CPI2019. You can find the links to the social media platforms on the conference website in the top left corner of the homepage. We're also live streaming our sessions. So if there's one that you're unable to attend, we're live streaming and we're recording, and hopefully we'll be able to post those after the fact.
At the request of one of our thought partners, we would like to acknowledge the recent passing of a longtime partner of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at the Harvard Law School, Miss Lily Estes. Miss Estes was a beloved community strategist in Richmond, Virginia, and one of the founders of the Residents of Public Housing in Richmond Against Mass Eviction. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the lands which we occupy during today's conference. I want to respectfully acknowledge the Massachusetts people, the Wampanoag tribe, and the Nipmuc people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Jackson and I would now like to take a couple minutes to share why we're involved with the conference and what we hope this conference will mean for all of you. Growing up along my cul-de-sac on Pondview Avenue, I learned the value of community from a young age. As a go-to babysitter in the neighborhood from the age of 15, I observed as parents cooked meals for the family across the street who was suffering from the loss of a loved one and supported one another gradually to become a cohesive Pondview community. During my college years, as I worked alongside community health workers, I saw the positive health impact of providing patients with a supportive advocate from the community who had unique insight into the patient's cultural values in addition to knowledge of the medical system. As I volunteered in a community health center after university, I once again found community amongst the mothers and children who traded healthy cooking tips at the health center's cooking class. Every encounter with a tight-knit community, my own or that of others, has left me with an enduring impression. Community is a source of strength and resilience for everyone. As you attend sessions throughout the day, you'll hear about the vastly different communities who are impacted by poverty and inequality. But we hope that you observe how these communities respond and develop solutions to the challenges that they encounter.
Thank you, Maya. When I was 5, I remember my mom and I getting pulled over in Knoxville, Tennessee. My mom was a busy college student and was speeding to make an appointment. I remember the motorcycle cop smile, issue a warning, and say, "Have a nice day," before pulling off. Later, when I was in high school, we took a family trip to the Grand Canyon. Somewhere on the interstate in Oklahoma, we get pulled over for speeding, but this time my stepdad is driving. He's black. This wasn't the first time we'd all been pulled over. The K-9 unit comes. An officer escorts my stepdad in handcuffs to the back of his car. Another officer peers into the minivan. When we tell him where we're going, he asks us quite seriously, "Who do you know in the Grand Canyon?" When the police hear that my mom is a lawyer, they let my stepdad go. But why did my stepdad and my mom receive such different treatment? Answering this question is part of why I care about justice. It's part of the reason why I'm here at the Kennedy School, why I decided to help lead this conference. Brian Stevenson says that the opposite of poverty is justice. It follows that this conference on poverty and inequality is a conference about justice. But what is justice? Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like in public. The conference organizing team has poured love into planning this day since the beginning of the school year, and we're excited to take that love and make it public today. I hope that each of you leaves this conference with a deeper understanding of where and how to show that love in your community to seek justice that counters poverty and inequality.
Thank you, Jackson. We would now like to introduce UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philip Alston, who will be delivering our keynote address this afternoon in addition to moderating the opening plenary, Untangling, Inequity, Intersectionality, and Poverty. The opening plenary will explore an approach to policy that includes the identities of all individuals impacted by the poverty documented in the UN report, seeking to understand and develop solutions to poverty and inequality that are mindful of intersectionality, complexity, and dignity. Philip Alston teaches international law, international criminal law, and a range of human rights subjects. He has degrees in law and economics from the University of Melbourne and a JSc from Berkeley. He previously taught at the European University Institute, the Australian National University, Harvard Law School, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He was one of the founders of both the European and the Australian and New Zealand Societies of International Law and was an editor-in-chief of the European Journal of International Law from 1996 through 2007. In 2014, he was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council as its Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. From 2004 to 2010, he was UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, undertaking official missions to Sri Lanka, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Philippines, Israel, Lebanon, Albania, Kenya, Brazil, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, and the United States. He has also been on the Independent International Commission on Kyrgyzstan and the UN Group of Experts on Darfur, and served as Special Advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the Millennium Development Goals, Chairperson and Rapporteur of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and UNICEF's Senior Legal Advisor on Children's Rights. Please welcome UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston.
Should I stay here or go there?
Yeah, you can, I mean, you're mic'd up. You can stay there.
Okay. I think I'll stay here if it's working. So I'm just chairing or moderating the panel this morning. Each speaker has 10 minutes, at which point an Exocet missile will appear from somewhere up there, but really try to keep the time. And then we have time for a discussion plus some questions from the audience. So I guess we're going to go in order.
Sure.
So Megan Minoka Hill is the program director for the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, director of the Honoring Nations program at Harvard Kennedy School. She's from the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, serves as the program director here. Through applied service and research, the Harvard Project aims to understand and foster the conditions under which sustained, self-determined social and economic development is possible. Megan currently serves on the Sustainable Native Communities Collaborative Board and as the secretary for the Dr. Rosa Minoka Hill Fund Board. She previously worked as the Director of Development for the University of New Mexico College of Arts and Sciences, Senior Program Officer at the Institute of American Indian Arts, and Director of Individual Giving at the American Indian College Fund. In her spare time, she volunteers for the Somerville Backpack Program, the Urban Agriculture Program, and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. That's all she does.
That's it. That's it. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Saturday. This is a great crowd. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you to Maya and Jackson and the entire, hi Julie, in the entire organizing committee for putting together this conference and having this really important dialogue this morning. So as said, my name is Megan Hill. I'm Turtle Clan from the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, and I have the honor of working at the Harvard Project, which really is this incredible think tank around Indigenous governance at the Kennedy School. So I was asked to talk a little bit about poverty and inequity in Indian country and responses to that, and so I thought it might be useful to start with a little context. And so to do that, so in the United States, there's 573 unique federally recognized tribes. There's about 4.1 million citizens, so it's about 1 to 2% of the US population. And these tribal nations are incredibly diverse, right? They have geographies that are completely different. So you have some tribal nations with just a few acres of land, to the Navajo Nation that their reservation is the size of West Virginia or France. Populations also span differently. Some tribal nations have under 100 citizens, and the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma has over 500,000. We are rural, but we are also urban. Our histories, our cultures, our governmental forms vary from theocracies to parliamentary systems to systems that are akin to what you see in Washington, D.C. And if you review US Census data, you're going to see that there's a wide variance in both social and economic conditions. And I think it's important to also know that American Indians aren't a racial group, right? We are political entities with citizenship in tribal nations with a unique relationship to the federal government. And I think you have to understand this to be able to engage in a meaningful conversation about intersectionality and solving these issues of inequity. So it's probably not surprising to many in the room that American Indians tend to inhabit the lower ends of any aggregate inequality statistical measure. We have shortest life expectancies, the lowest levels of educational attainment, violent crime and infant mortality are 3 to 4 times the national average, access to adequate housing lags far behind, and there's the systematic underfunding. And the reasons for this are really multifaceted, but there is a very clear line between these inequities to our political relationship with the federal government through policies that were aimed at genocide and assimilation and dependence. But what I want to share with you today is that's really not the whole story. And what I want to talk about is that there's this incredible renaissance happening throughout Indian country that's grounded in tribal nations asserting their self-determination and setting a course to reverse these inequities and poverty on their own terms. So in fact, from 1990 to 2010, reservation incomes grew 5 times faster than the incomes of the rest of the United States. That's incredible, right? 5 times faster. But even if we were able to maintain this growth, there's such a lag, there's such a gap that would still take generations to even come close to parity. So the work of the Harvard Project has really dug into this. And part of what we're really focused on is the central question of why do some tribal nations find economic and social success where others don't? And why is there this inequity between tribal nations, but also between tribal nations and our non-native neighbors? And so to think about this, I'd like to share two snapshots of tribal nations that we work with, because I think they illustrate a point, and then I'll give you a little postscript update. The first tribe is in Montana. They have about 13,000 citizens, a very large land base, lots of marketable resources. So they have actually an estimated 9 billion with a B, tons of coal, oil, natural gas, timber, sort of other, they're very rich in these natural resources. They also have high access to markets. And interestingly, they have probably the highest educational attainment rates throughout Indian country. So not only are their citizens graduating from high school, they're graduating from college and they're getting post-graduate degrees as well. So if you think about your Econ 101 textbooks, it's checking some boxes, right? It looks pretty good for them. Yet, they've got really high unemployment, depending on the time of year, 60, 70, 80%. They have a high incidence of social problems, so there's gang issues, there's substance abuse issues, there's violence issues, a history of political turmoil, and this cycle of continuing poverty where the nation has a lot of difficulty achieving their goals and creating an environment for their people to thrive and build these sort of healthy futures for their children. So I'd like to counterpose that with another tribe that we work with in Mississippi, the Mississippi Choctaw. They have a similar population, about 11,000 citizens. They have a fragmented land base that's much smaller. Not many marketable resources. They're isolated from markets. They have a lack of infrastructure. They're actually located in Philadelphia, Mississippi, if anybody knows that area. And this tribe in particular had very low educational attainment rates, and so it wasn't looking good, right? It sort of looks a bleak outlook for this particular tribe, going back to our check boxes. Yet, they have one of the lowest unemployment rates in all of Indian country, around 2 and 3%, right? In fact, every nation's citizen that wants a job has one, and there's not enough citizens to fill those jobs, so they're actually importing labor. So at 8 a.m., there's a traffic jam getting onto the reservation of Indian folks, white folks, African American folks, just trying to go to work. And so you see sort of this regional rising tide effect too. When the tribe is doing well, everybody's doing well. They have numerous successful nation-owned enterprises, primarily manufacturing. They do have a casino now, but that came very late. The bulk of their resources comes from this manufacturing sector. And it's resulted in a lot of funds to be able to provide and pursue other goals. And in fact, one of the things that they did is they invested heavily in their healthcare and public safety programs. And they ended up, in a time span of 15 years, they raised life expectancy 20 years. I don't know if anybody's from public health, but it's unheard of, right? It's incredible. But it's by these systematic investments in public safety programs and healthcare. So what's happening here? So on one hand, you have a tribe that seems to have everything and is floundering. And on the other hand, you have a tribe with not a lot going on, and it's flourishing. And so we found in 32 years of on-the-ground research that fundamentally governance matters. It's about how you organize yourself. And so once your governance house is in order, there's a really solid foundation from which to build successful, sustainable programs that meet the needs of your citizens. And these issues around poverty and inequity start to heal in every area, from transportation to policing to management of natural resources to housing and healthcare. And so really the nutshell, or our nutshell is that when tribal nations exercise their sovereignty and make their own decisions and back that up with capable institutions, so like education codes or justice systems, sort of the non-sexy stuff, and that's matched to who they are as a people, their culture, they find stability and success. And so just a quick postscript to the short vignettes I gave. That first tribe that was struggling, what was happening is that they were operating under a foreign constitution that had been imposed by the US government that centralized power. This centralizing of power was not a fit for this particular tribe, where traditionally power was decentralized into districts. And so a couple of years ago, they underwent a constitutional reform to recognize that decentralization, and things are starting to turn around for them now. So it's actually pretty exciting. And I know I don't have time to discuss this, but if you're interested in what this looks like in terms of housing or prison reintegration or climate change or education, we have hundreds of resources on our website that share examples of how tribal nations are approaching and solving these issues, and how you can tease out lessons from what they're doing and adapt them and apply them to other contexts, whether native or non-native. So I hope I've planted some seeds, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Denise Marie Ordway. Denise is the managing editor of Journalists Resource here at the Kennedy School, which she joined in 2015 after working as a reporter for newspapers and radio stations in the US and Central America, including the Orlando Sentinel and Philadelphia Inquirer. Her work also has appeared in publications such as USA Today, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and Washington Post. There's no Breitbart in there, I see. She's received a multitude of national, regional, and state-level journalism awards and was named as a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2013 for an investigative series she led that focused on hazing and other problems at Florida A&M University. She was a 2014-15 Fellow of Harvard's Nyman Foundation for Journalism and serves on the Journalist Advisory Board to the National Education Writers Association. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So as he mentioned, I'm the managing editor of a journalism project here at the Kennedy School. And one of the things that we do is we train journalists. One thing that I try to do, I try to do a lot of is I try to get reporters and editors in newsrooms around the country to really think about how their work affects other people. I try to get them to understand that the choices they make in terms of word selection, in terms of the adjectives they're using, in terms of the headlines that they're putting on things that are going out on social media, the way they're framing a photo, the way they select who's going to be in that photo to represent an idea or a problem, how that impacts people, and it matters a lot. When we're talking about lower income folks, when we're talking about people who are experiencing inequality, these words and these images, they matter a lot. Whether they're shared in a local community or they're going out around the globe, they're really affecting how people not only view these individuals, but how they feel about them. And not only that, but they're affecting how low-income folks, people who are experiencing inequality, how they feel about themselves, how they view themselves and their place in the world. So what I try to get journalists to understand is that words and images, they stick with us. They become part of the story that we tell ourselves about people we don't know very much about. And you know, when you're someone who doesn't come from a low-income household, when you're someone who doesn't spend a lot of time with people who are experiencing different kinds of inequality, we're relying on what we're seeing in news broadcasts, and we're relying on what we're reading in the magazines and the newspapers, and what we're seeing in photos to help us build what we know about people we don't know very much about. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of some things I found online last night to help you kind of understand what I'm talking about here. So I did a quick search, and I was like, I want to see what people are seeing when they look at who participates in the federal food stamp program. So what are people looking at? What are the images they're being shown? And I looked at the stories and I looked for the images, and the vast majority of the images I found in my search, they were of women, they were of children, they were of African American women and children. So I know as a journalist who, I've covered issues of poverty, and I know the majority of people who are participating in the food stamp program, they're not African American, the majority are not. So I looked up a new report on, what is it, FDA or the Department of Agriculture's website. They just put out a new report just this week. And I looked it up, and it's just under a quarter of the individuals who participate in the federal food stamp program are African American. The people who are most likely to participate in the program are white non-Hispanic people. But that's not who you're seeing, or that at least according to my sample and what I know in journalism, that's not who you're seeing. Let me give you another example. This is a headline I came across last night. Low income equals low test scores in our schools. So I'm not sure where to start in my criticism of this headline. But what I'm bringing it forward, the reason I'm bringing it here is to show you that, let's say you don't know anything about poor people. Let's say you don't hang out with poor people, you've never been poor. You're hearing that headline, how are you feeling? What if you're a parent? Are you thinking about, what's that going to do to my child's education and my child's learning? Or what's going on? You know, you might be thinking, what's going on with poor people? Why are their test scores low? What's going on? So I have a very personal interest in helping journalists think about these images and words and how they're telling stories, because I come from a low-income background. So I was raised on food stamps. I was raised in a low-income trailer park. My mother did not finish elementary school. I know what it's like to be in public school, and my best meal of the day was the free lunch I just got in the cafeteria that the other kids don't want to eat. That was my best meal. I know what it's like to have 2 pairs of pants. I know what it's like to dodge your teachers and dodge the authorities, because if they notice something, or if you say something that you didn't mean to say, they're going to report your family. I know what that's like. My parents grew up very poor. Both of my parents were raised in homes in the woods that by middle class standards would be shacks. They had no running water. Everyone goes outside to go to the bathroom. My grandmother passed away several years ago. She still lived in that tiny house with no indoor plumbing. That was their experience. That's their lived experience. When I was a very young adult, I married an undocumented man from Central America. We had a child together, and I became very familiar with the migrant farm worker community in Central Florida. In Florida, that's where I'm from. That's where I grew up most of my life. That's where I lived just until a few years ago when I moved up here to Massachusetts. My current partner, who I've known since we were kids, he has a GED. He's a high school dropout. He makes minimum wage. We're raising a bunch of kids together. We got 5 of them. My siblings didn't finish high school. My sisters, they live in different states. They either rely on public health assistance or cash assistance, food assistance programs. My baby sister, she's been arrested multiple times. She's been homeless multiple times. So I do know something about poverty. I wish more journalists had this experience so they could bring this into newsrooms to help newsrooms and other journalists who don't have these experiences not only think about how they're telling stories and choosing what stories to tell, but who gets to tell those stories. I'd like to give you I'd like to offer 4 of the suggestions that I give to journalists, just kind of to show you what I'm trying to get people to think about. And while I'm sure a lot of you guys are not journalists and are not interested in journalism, hopefully you might learn something and maybe kind of think about things a little differently. One is definitions. Think really hard about the words that you're using when you're talking to and about people who are either experiencing poverty or experiencing some kind of inequality. Think about the words you're using. Not everyone is working with the same vocabulary, and different words mean different things to different people. I can't tell you, so I've been at Harvard for several years now, and I can't tell you how many times in conversations with people I've had, students, faculty, administrators who were talking about someone describing them as low income or describing a scenario as poverty, and I'm like, that's financially comfortable to me. That might even be, I might have considered that wealthy. So think about the fact that some people also you may consider poor and they don't consider themselves poor, or you might think about their lives seem really filled with challenges and injustices, and they may not think of their lives in that way. So ask yourself if you're putting your adjectives and your values and your judgments on them. Character types, journalists and people tend to put low-income people into 3 buckets: victim, criminal, the person, the exception, the person who rose above the odds and did some good stuff. So just remember that these kind of representations, they reinforce stereotypes, and they don't represent the full range of people and personalities who are within this group. I'm going really fast. Phrases like poverty-ridden and poverty-stricken, I hate those phrases, and what do they mean? They're so vague. What are you trying to say with it? So I would just advise, be specific. If you're talking about a neighborhood, describe the neighborhood. Use statistics, use concrete information, And don't use words that really don't mean anything and actually can be very hurtful. And lastly, I'll be real quick. Remember that a life lived in poverty is not always about tragedy. It's not always about hopelessness. Just like if you're from a wealthy family, you're not always happy and having a great life. If you only focus on those parts of a person's life, you're missing the whole story. So, thank you.
Thanks, Denise. The next speaker is Xavier Rami, who is the CEO of Justice Informed, a social impact consulting firm based in Chicago. Combining his background in economics, extensive management and social impact experience, deep network and practice in institutional change, and direct action campaigning in the Black Lives Matter movement, Xavier leads a company that brings a wealth of experience and networks to clients seeking catalyzed strategies for diversity, equity, inclusion, philanthropy, CSR, and community engagement. He's an award-winning social sector leader, international public speaker, and workplace and community cultural practice translator. A native Chicagoan, he's a recognizable voice on the topics of community and economic development, intersectional social justice, racial justice, public policy, and 21st century inclusion and equity practices. Xavier served as the head of the Social Innovation and Philanthropy Strategy in the University of Chicago's Office of Civic Engagement, managed multi-million-dollar philanthropic portfolios to support employment and income opportunities for marginalized communities, and worked as a nonprofit director of development in Chicago's North Lawndale community. He's consulted for institutions and persons across the world, predominantly in the US and Africa. He's a founding member of the #LetUsBreathe collective, an artist-activist group working to engage the challenges of police violence, anti-blackness, and the marginalization of divested communities. He's a member of Rotary International, an executive board member of Young Chicago Authors, and the Chicago Center for Arts and Technology. Welcome, Xavier.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you all? This is like a classroom because we are at a university, so I need to hear you all. How's everyone today? Good, good. My name is Xavier Rami. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Justice Informed LLC. I know you all have often heard of corporations with the word justice in it, correct? Yeah. Most people ask me, can I volunteer at your organization? And how's the nonprofit going? The reason why it's called Justice Informed is because we believe that we need to, one, change the face of expertise. The reality of consulting, you all are familiar with the consulting world, is that what they do is they sell ideas. When you sell ideas, you have the ability to hold the space of expertise that then drives the strategies that oftentimes ends up compromising or harming the communities that we should be caring about the most. Secondarily, people who have a lived experience that is so of value are often not compensated for having that, and they're often also put on pro bono councils run by the consulting firms to then extract that information and sell it back to the client. So I started Justice Informed to get at that issue. We hire activists, we hire artists, we hire executive directors from nonprofits, we hire caseworkers, we hire the elderly, we hire young folks fresh out of college. We hire the folks that would never get hired in the big firms. And we do that because it's a bet we're making. That for myself, as the child of the generation that fought for the legal rights for me to even stand here and speak today, it is my job to accelerate the rate of change of the social order of this country. I don't take that lightly. I believe that we have to be intelligent about the way we go forward in doing that. In 2016, I think that we all saw, depending on which side of the spectrum you're on, a bit of a shift. I'll call it that. A bit of a shift in the expectations of what America should be and what the Western world should hold itself to understand and represent. Some of us were accelerated in our call for justice, in our push to creatively engage issues of injustice, systemic inequality, and others. And some of us were just really upset. Sent some memes around, had some good GIFs, went back to brunch. There's so much work to be done right now. And the reality of what injustice, what poverty, what inequality is, I don't think is actually realized in many of the spaces where we gather. One of the things that our firm works around is diversity, equity, inclusion. This is the internal culture that says, what does it mean for a person of a marginalized background to be engaged in an institutional space where white supremacy is often the norm? The reality is when we're doing some of our trainings, even the notion of having a suit on, we have to put on the table. What does it serve, truly, to understand a suit jacket in the space of intelligence? The question of the normalization of professionalization. As a black man, I know what it means for people to say, pull up your pants. It reminds me of what they once said of the indigenous people. Kill the Indian, keep the man. It is this focus on production over the producer that continues to divide us. The focus on production over the producer. That the sentience of a human life is not paramount to the realities of human production. And that the presence of the producer has to be justified in such a way that it has to line up with the normative values, as damaging and as harmful as they may be, of what is often produced the very need for diversity, equity, inclusion, and things like corporate social responsibility. And so specifically, we look at how can we actually engage this issue of inequality, really? The place where adults congregate the most is actually the place where we do the least in terms of pushing this forward, and that's at work. The average adult spends most of their waking hours at work. And that is the space where we have said is off limits for conversations about inequality, off limits for conversations about poverty, when the reality is that the wages that are conferred as a return to labor often produce the inequality that we see. And the question of, do the people who are receiving these wages actually have the ability to understand not just the civic responsibility, but the social opportunity to really drive forward change individually, to not look for government to solve anything, though they have many things to resolve, to not look for a company to resolve something, though they have much to resolve, but that the same person that goes to work or comes to school and says, we want more diversity, we want more inclusion, we want a company that cares, is the same person who often goes back and segregates the city. They take those same dollars that they receive from their fancy job and they go live in a community that actually isn't changing the root issues of segregation. They're only perpetuating it. And so civic education spaces are necessary in the 21st century, given that we have so many corporations right now that are implementing, these 21st century companies are implementing 20th century strategies that produce 19th century social outcomes. In order to get ahead of that, we have to see the role of the conferral of expertise, consulting, as actually changing the way the individual sees their stake in the work moving forward. That the professionalization of social impact work is such that in spaces like Harvard Kennedy School, or where I used to work, the University of Chicago, the people who are doing the work of social change often also don't reflect the people who are most affected by the lack of social change. And when you look at the friends groups, the social circles, the influence networks that they're often a part of, you still don't see the reality of their belief that you do need to diversify the people around you. And so we make this bet, and we say that we believe that the stories of those who have experienced injustice, those who are the victims of inequality, matter. I think there are many in this room who would agree. Their stories matter. I also believe that the wages they don't get matter. And that is why I'm proud to say that what we've been working towards is actually bearing fruit. There are many people who say no one wants to do the right thing, no company wants to do the right thing, no person really cares. You can't force someone to care. And I've learned that if you extend an invitation, if you bring in real data, and you insist on holding the line for the representation of the people we said we cared about, you can do quite a bit. Oftentimes, the educational space is the last time you're going to be in a diverse environment. When you leave school, the gears of injustice and segregation lock into place. In 5 years, I hope that you will ask yourself, where did all my friends go? What happened to them? It's so easy to get into the culture of white supremacy, which is to say the culture of forgetting that there are more people in this world than just those who are or assimilate into whiteness. Whiteness is not a problem. White supremacy is. I had to learn to love myself despite the person that I was insisting on becoming so that I could be financially productive in this world. That the fears that my grandmother had, that my father had, or that my mother had, of a black boy growing up in Chicago, of running from gangs, of surviving the poverty that they created for me, were ones that I couldn't listen to anymore. And the awesome thing about it is I live in a time where it's possible to do something about it. I want to thank you all for your time. Feel free to look up Justice Informed or myself. I write quite often on these things, and I hope that you all will join us in this fight, because that's what it is, for the future of what an inclusive country, an equitable country, truly looks like. Thank you.
Thanks, Xavier. The final speaker then on the panel is Nadia Okamoto. Nadia is the founder and executive director of Period. She grew up in Portland, Oregon, is 20 years old, Harvard student on a leave of absence, founder and executive director of Period.org, an organization she founded at the age of 16. It's now the largest youth-run NGO in women's health and one of the fastest growing ones here in the US. Since 2014, they've addressed over 400,000 periods and registered over 230 campus chapters. In 2017, Nadia ran for office here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Didn't win, but her campaign team made historic waves in mobilizing young people on the ground and at polls. Nadia recently published her debut book, Period Power, a manifesto for the menstrual movement, with Simon & Schuster, which made the Kirkus Reviews list for Best Young Adult Nonfiction of 2018. Most recently, she's become the Chief Brand Officer of JUV Consulting, a Generation Z marketing agency based in New York City. She was named to InStyle magazine's The Badass 50. Meet the women who are changing the world, along with people like Michelle Obama, Ariana Grande, and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. Welcome, Nadia.
Thank you. Hi. First of all, I just want to say it's such an honor to be up here with all of you. I'm just incredibly inspired and a little bit nervous now to follow up. I'm actually 21 years old as of a few weeks ago, which is very exciting for me. I'm a rising junior here at Harvard College on a leave of absence to work on periods and Gen Z. And I was asked to come talk a little bit about my experience with poverty and then my work in the space. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I'm so passionate about periods, because I know it's not the most common thing to be so obsessed with. But so my passion for periods comes from a really personal place. I founded the organization when I was 16 years old and a junior in high school, really inspired by my family's own experience with being displaced from our home. So the spring of my freshman year of high school, my mom ended up parting ways with her job, and within a few months we couldn't afford to live in our own home, so we ended up moving out, couch surfing with our closest friends who have since become family. And during that time, my commute to school turned from 12 minutes to over 2 hours long on public transportation. And where I would change buses was in an area called Old Town Portland, Oregon, where there are like 10 homeless shelters in a 2-block radius. And I would regularly see these homeless women to and from school, and as sort of the quirky, extroverted 16-year-old I was, would just get into conversations with them to pass the time. And at the time, I was really fascinated with stories of hardship, sort of to better understand what my family was going through, but also I think just to distract myself from what my family was going through. So I'd ask them anything from like, how did you get to this situation? What was it like growing up? Where is your family? Do you have a significant other? Like, what's your school like? Have you tried to get a job? Like, all of these questions. And through those answers, started to realize a lot about my family's own background, right? In talking with them and hearing their stories of growing up with domestic violence and sex abuse in their own families, I started realizing that that was something that was also present in my own family, but I'd never heard anyone call that behavior out, right? And I also started asking this question of what do you find most challenging about your living situation? And through asking that question was how I discovered this unaddressed natural need of periods. I would write down all of the stories I heard throughout the day in my journal and collected this accidental anthology of their stories of using toilet paper and socks and brown paper grocery bags and cardboard and cotton balls to take care of their periods. And the moments that stuck with me were where they would like take a piece of cardboard that they were sitting on, take off the sides of the cardboard and rub the insides to make it a little bit more flexible and use it as a menstrual pad, right? And I started to become obsessed with not only these stories of using literal trash to take care of their periods, but also noticing how I talked about periods with them, right? Like if no one was around, we would whisper the word period like it was something shameful, like a bad word that we had to hide. I would notice that like in my own background as a middle schooler and public school, me and like 8 of my best friends never participated in gym class but got straight A's because we told our gym teacher that we were on our period simultaneously for 3 years and he never questioned it, right? So it was sort of realizing how the period stigma existed in my own life, but then also realizing, I think, a lot of the privilege that I had in my living experience at the time. Like, at that time, my family was living from unemployment check to unemployment check from my mom, and I was at a private school in Portland, Oregon, which is one of the wealthiest private schools in the area, where they had no free and reduced lunch program when we got there and had to create one for my sisters and I after my sister was hospitalized for an eating disorder. We went to a school where my face is, I believe, still on the front of the financial aid packet, and a school where we had to petition to get free bus passes so I could get to school, right? But at the same time, I would talk to these homeless women who made me realize how much privilege I had, because I had access to education. No matter what, my mom made sure that we had a roof over our heads, and I had opportunity to get out of the abusive situations that I was in. So hearing their stories of dealing with periods sort of catalyzed this maybe unhealthy obsession with period poverty with me, where in my free time I would just Google keywords about period poverty, and I wanted to know more about what the situation was like both in the US and abroad. And through Googling, learned that periods are the #1 reason why girls miss school in developing countries. A girl's first period is often the single event that leads to her dropping out of school, getting married early, undergoing female genital mutilation, or social isolation. Here in the US, period-related pain has been listed as a leading cause of absenteeism for girls in the US, more than the common cold, but we have no research to really figure out the magnitude of the issue. And then also in 2014, I learned that then the number was 40, now it's 35. But 40 states in the US had a sales tax on period products because they're considered luxury items. Meanwhile, products like Rogaine and Viagra and penile pumps, which I had to look up what those were at the time, products like those were considered more medical necessities and necessary items, so they didn't have that luxury sales tax on them. So I was really learning about these issues and being like, how is it 2014 at the time, and people have been menstruating since the beginning of humankind? Menstruation makes human life possible, yet it's something that we don't really think about and is not included in conversations, and even like food stamps don't cover period products as a necessity still today, right? So I decided to start a nonprofit. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that the word nonprofit was thrown around in like the adult world as doing something good for your community. So I started mobilizing with friends, just collecting products, distributing them out to local chapters, or local shelters, started raising money in any way I could, and then buying those products, posting about it on social media, naturally just to share with friends. Within a matter of months, we had messages from hundreds of students all around the country and journalists wanting to write about this because they had never thought about periods as something that homeless people needed. So within a matter of a few months, we had national chapters being started. Fast forward 4.5 years, we've addressed now over 550,000 periods through product distribution for people in need, from tampons to pads to menstrual cups, period underwear. And we've also registered over 300 campus chapters at universities and high schools around the US and in 15 other countries as well. And so with all of that, we were just named the largest youth-run NGO in women's health in the world. And a lot of that just came from mobilizing people just to realize that this need that they have experienced themselves or what it grew up around was just something they had never really thought about before, right? And I think I'm really excited to be here to talk about intersectionality because that's one of the reasons I fell in love with this movement, right? Because menstruation is one of the experiences of no matter where you're from, how you identify, what resources you have, if you were assigned female at birth, you will probably experience menstruation for an average of 40 years of your life on a monthly basis. So it is something that connects all communities and all of these human communities especially. But a lot of my story of taking action came from just pure passion that sort of manifested from my family's own experiences. And I think I fell in love with service leadership because it was my way of reconciling a lot of the privileges that I do have, right? And I got even more committed to my work with Period, especially after coming to Harvard. I'm a full financial aid student here up until now. And I think when I came here, I realized how much privilege is on this campus that we don't really recognize, right? You come to Harvard and it's this narrative of you belong here, we are the best of the best, but realizing how much privilege that comes with being at a place like Harvard is not really talked about within a matter of weeks, right? So when I came to Harvard, I became more obsessed with this idea of devoting myself to the menstrual movement because it became my way of reconciling a lot of the privileges that I do have. Sort of the synergies of passion and just trying to take action in any way I could also manifested my first year here at Harvard. Cambridge has been a really special place to me growing up. I grew up between New York City and Portland, Oregon. When I grew up in New York City, my parents were still together and we experienced a lot of domestic abuse and violence with my dad. And when we had nowhere else to go, we would actually come to Cambridge where my godmother lives a few blocks from the Quad here in Harvard. And so the Harvard campus and Cambridge community sort of became a home when we didn't have anywhere else to go. It's been this special place where we came multiple times a year when we needed to seek refuge. So when I came here, I was really excited to explore the area and would go on these runs, and I would regularly find these intersections in Cambridge where I would feel like I was standing at the lines of gentrification, right? Where I could notice that on one side of the street, it was a lot of people of color in public housing, and on the other side of the street was all the Harvard faculty, right? So I went back to Google and I downloaded every publicly accessible report on income inequality and housing affordability, and accidentally ended up with this 80-page Word document about what I thought City Council could be doing better. And I just started taking it to City Council meetings and meeting with city councilors, telling them my ideas, trying to fight this animosity I discovered within the town and gown relationship of really, City Council and local residents feeling like a lot of the gentrification, especially in Harvard Square, was because of the demand of students, right? And becoming really passionate about, wanting students to be more involved, because the median age in Cambridge is 33 years old, but the median age on City Council at the time was 67, right? So wanting it to be pushing for more representative democracy. And as I started to advocate more for local issues, people started joking with me like, if you have so many ideas, why don't you run yourself? And it was a joke for me because I had never considered running for office. So I Googled it at one point, saw that you had to be 18, and I was 19 at the time, so I felt that I was more than qualified to run for office. And so I launched a campaign and ran for about 6 months, and we ran in a field of 26 candidates, and we ran taking no special interest or development dollars, and it was one of the most exhausting, terrifying, but meaningful experiences of my life, where we launched one night and woke up the next morning with a viral campaign video and support from all over the country for not only being a young person running for office, but being an Asian American running for office, a part of my identity that I didn't even expect to come into the picture, but also getting death threats every day for the next 6 months for being a young person, a young Asian American wanting to get into politics, right? But we knocked on 22,000 doors and we lost, but we ended up making some historic waves of student youth turnout and actually tripling the turnout here on Harvard campus, which was enough for me to be like, hands off, really excited for it. And over the last year and taking time off, I've sort of devoted myself more to this mission of continuing to advance the menstrual movement and fighting for the belief that I really believe that the menstrual movement is sort of a key to global development in this overall fight for gender equality. Because when we look at how the UN and the World Health Organization describe gender equality and the necessary steps to breaking the cycle of poverty, it falls into these 4 buckets of education, healthcare, economic mobility, representation in politics, and decision making. And already I've talked about how periods and the lack of access to period care are a significant barrier of access to equal opportunity in education, healthcare, economic mobility. But also I think that the way we solve it is by pushing for more representative democracy and equal representation in high positions of decision making, right? So when we look at how still today in the US, less than 20% of our congressional positions are held by women, if that 80% of men are uncomfortable to talk about periods, we will continue to have 35 states that have a tampon tax, right? We will continue to have food stamps that don't consider period products a necessity, right? And so a lot of our work is trying to push for encouraging not only women and people who menstruate to talk about periods, but all people to recognize it as a natural need. And I don't consider this a women's issue. I don't consider this only a part of the women's movement. I consider this a very human issue, right? The fact that we come from the fundamental belief that it is a human right to be able to discover and reach your full potential regardless of a natural need, and periods very much are a part of what it means to be a natural need. My work with Juve Consulting is rather recent. So I'm Chief Brand Officer at Juve Consulting, which is a Gen Z marketing agency. And we work with small companies all the way up to Microsoft, all Unilever brands, and American Express, and PepsiCo, and some other companies like that. And we basically come from this belief that if you're going to talk at a table about how to affect another group demographic, specifically young people, you're going to talk about how to engage them and how to affect them, those people should be represented at the table, right? So we're simply bringing young people to the table to be a part of those discussions, and we fight for the right of all people to be represented when they're being talked about at all levels of identity. So that's a little bit about my story and my background, and thank you for listening to me talk about periods. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much. I guess what we really need now is an elderly white male to slow the pace, slow the expectations, damp down enthusiasm. I think the main challenge in a way is to try to reflect on how the specific places that you come from, which are all very fraught in their own way, you've outlined all of the big challenges and so on, how they fit into the broader challenges of addressing poverty in the United States. Because it's possible to go off into each of these different areas and say, I'm really going to make a difference. But to what extent can you do that while the overall framework remains hostile? And I guess the question then to put in a sense is, if you were asked to focus on one issue or set of issues in terms of changing policies in the United States, what would that be? Does anyone want to?
Yep.
Xavier?
So I've really stayed, if you ever come to Chicago and you ask what does Xavier really care about, I think anyone who knows me is going to say the same thing. I don't believe you can move forward any policies that are effective at shifting the way inequality and poverty are experienced in America, specifically to black communities, until we understand the role of policing. So much of my work has been dead set on that. Part of the reason for that is, one, when you look at municipal budgets, they're often, particularly for communities of color, they are found to be in policing. So in Chicago, for example, 40% of our corporate budget is for policing. That is why I consider Chicago's community development strategy to be police. Most of those dollars go into neighborhoods like the one I grew up in, North Lawndale. They are what produce the stories that you all likely read about Chicago, and it is often misconstrued in the media, the real root issues around that, because the intersections between policing and housing are so real. because oftentimes the reality is when people feel that their property is being in some way potentially harmed, there's a potential for harm, the first and actually the only resource that the average person has is to call a police officer. The reality of the cost of it are one. Secondly, the reality of what it actually feels like to be policed. I don't know if you all know what it feels like to be hunted. I do. It is not a good feeling. When you walk down a street in Chicago and you literally feel like you're being hunted. You see cars slowly going with you as you walk. Ones that slowly patrol around the streets as you're going. Ones that when you walk into a building, all eyes are on you. You're being hunted. You're being hunted. And it's more than demoralizing. It's scary. Until we get a rein on the connection between those of access and privilege and their insistence on utilizing people with guns to protect the things that they've produced, ill-gotten or rightfully gotten, we are not going to see the types of effects, for instance, in racial reconciliation conversations. I hate those conversations. We're in the whole invite your black friends to church month. And that's what we do, Black History Month. Black History Month isn't even for black people. It's for people who don't know black history. But the reality of that is that we can't get, specifically in the black community, we can't really address issues of poverty and inequality until we address how much money, how much insistence, and the net effect on the human psychology as well as the human experience as it relates to policing.
Okay, great. I'm sure we can deal with that very easily later on. Megan?
I mean, the work we do at the Harvard Project, for us, it's all structural, right? I mean, I grew up in a house where my father was an educator and would always tell me, you know, go to school, get an education, and come back and work for your people. You've got to build your people, but it has to be through education. And I saw the approach that my particular tribe was taking and sort of also in the city that I lived in these very siloed approaches that never intersected. And it's because the structures were set up that way. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to sort of lead where we sit and figure out where our expertise is to be able to push that structure in a way that opens the table for all of us. And I just might tell a quick story. I was working up with the Sitka tribe in Alaska this summer and on issues of child welfare. And what was happening is very high proportions of these Native children were being taken out of their families, out of the tribe, and raised by folks that are well-meaning but have no context for where these children come from. And so what was happening is if a child was placed in a Native home, there was higher scrutiny. And so the state was seeing this one child during this week. One day got off the bus here, the next day got off the bus here, got off the bus, every day got off at a bus at a different place. And the state saw that as incongruous. They saw that as a lack of care for this child. The family and the tribe saw that as a whole circle of care for this child and a whole net of safety net for this child to be able to have access to these people and to these resources that were taking care of them. And so what they had to do is change the structure and the dynamic between the state of Alaska and this tribe, and actually all tribes in Alaska, to change the structure so that there was this cross-training and cross-pollination between the tribes and the state, so they understood the words. They had a common vocabulary that Denise talked about so that they could actually support these communities and these children and reach them before they fell through the cracks. Mm.
I would say that if there was one issue that I had to stick with, it would be periods. And I hate to be a broken record here, but the reason I love this movement so much, and I talk about this a lot in my book, Period Power 2, is two things. One,
no advertising, please.
Okay, shameless plug. But is one, because the impact is so measurable, but also it's so intersectional, right? So on the measurable side of things, like we're working in policy from the local to the federal level and have very tangible goals, right? At the local level, we're mobilizing chapters all around the country and actively passing legislation with city councils and school governments to get period products in school restrooms, to get them in homeless shelters, to get them more in prisons. At the state level, we know we have 35 states left to get the tampon tax repealed. At the federal level, there are 2 pieces of legislation already out there and passed the House that are about getting period products to be covered by food stamps and by financial assistance programs. So there's these very tangible goals, but also it's so intersectional, right? And I think that that's something I love, especially as a very curious young activist. Like, I think as an activist, it's very hard to feel fulfilled because you always feel like you could be doing more, and you always learn about other issues that you can also care about, right? And I think what I love about the menstrual movement is, whether it be climate change, we're involved in those conversations because the average tampon or pad that's disposable takes 5 to 8 centuries to decompose, and the average menstruator uses 17,000 of them in their lifetime, right? Whether it's about LGBTQ issues and the fact that you don't hear me talking about this as a women and girls issue, but a menstruator issue, because it's something that transgender men and people who are non-binary also experience. Or if it's something where we're talking about race, right? The rate of black women experiencing uterine fibroids is almost double than any other racial or ethnic community. And a lot of that is unknown because there's been a lack of studying around it. And because of a lack of education in a lot of those communities, the rate of hysterectomies is 3 times as much as any other racial group as well. So I think that that's why I really love this movement, is because we have very tangible goals, but also it's sort of a gateway to talk to a lot of different communities and a lot of different groups of community organizers, whether it be around race or we work with a lot of Native American reservations because there's a lack of funding for period products there especially. So I think it acts as a sort of gateway to be involved in a lot of different topics.
Okay, great.
2 things I would add to that. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The 2 things that I would add to that is, so as a journalist, you know, I pay a lot of attention to the debates that are being had and the way that people are developing and creating policy. And one thing that I see time and time and time again is that they're not looking at what the research says. So people spend a lot of time, scholars spend a lot of time, researchers spend a lot of time looking at issues that affect people experiencing poverty, inequality, but the policymakers are not always looking at it. And I can't tell you how many times I've noticed and written about, you know, this very well-meaning, good-hearted policymaker wants to do this thing, make this change to help this group. And they don't know, and they would have known if they looked at the research, that it's either not really going to do very much or it's going to backfire. And so I think that needs to be part of the conversation too. Second of all, is we got to figure out a way to help the people who are living these experiences lead. Help them speak out, help them help other people understand their experiences and how they are experiencing the inequality, how they think maybe solutions need to be looked at. You know, we all know that the people who are making laws and the people who are in leadership positions, they're not always those people. They're often not those people. And the people who are leading advocacy efforts, you know, a lot of times, you know, they're very well educated and they have great intentions, but they don't live, they're not from that experience. And so I'm just thinking, help them lead and help them look for solutions.
Okay, I mean, you focused in part on the media. I guess that's a relevant issue for all of us in a sense. I mean, I, tragically, because of my age, still read the New York Times every morning in hard copy. But I realize that I'm a dinosaur doing that. I realize that we're not going to change the world by getting an op-ed in the New York Times. The question is, where do new media, where do old media fit in the sort of issues that you're dealing with? Do they play an important role, or is the challenge to bypass them? Xavier, would you see it as a sort of white-dominated old media, and instead one needs to be developing new approaches through social media to bypass, or is there a way of trying to influence in the way that's been suggested?
There are, I mean, media is one of my favorite growing industries.
Right.
Specifically, there's a lot of work right now that's being done through foundations. Philanthropic foundations are putting good money towards innovative new ways of looking at media production. So civic knowledge, civic media, these types of things, that's sort of the nomenclature of it. MacArthur Foundation, McCormick Foundation have been putting a lot towards it. I know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have been looking at it as well. But the question around, to your point, of how do you shift the narrative of a story that then shifts the narrative of an issue by changing who is telling that story, I think is huge. The challenge there is there are folks who really do like the way we've always done it. And particularly this is one of the things that I deal with a lot, specifically in diversity, equity, inclusion. People who are in the 40 or 50 plus point, they've been educated in a certain way. To then look at changing that, you do have to go through a re-education. And so the question is of cost there, right? Your time, your understanding of what the work is, but also it's a dignity issue, because I think a lot of people are feeling called out as if they've been doing something wrong for years. So when I come in and I say, hey, the way that you all, for instance, in North Lawndale, the way that people talk about kids in North Lawndale, I think it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It's one of the reasons why I picked up a camera years ago and started a photography company. It was because the pictures that nonprofits were using about my neighborhood were terrible, and there was no dignity in them, which then confronts the way that nonprofits raise their money, right? But this is media production. It puts some people in a defensive position, and they get upset about that. I understand that. But I think this is, regardless, it's such a fruitful conversation. We do need to make better strides towards changing who tells stories, the value that we put on the stories that are told by, I would say, non-traditional media producers, young people, kids, elders. Nobody really listens to elders creating media unless they're old white guys. These sorts of things.
Okay.
I would wholeheartedly agree with Xavier. And sort of to add on that, I think that, yes, there's an absolute need to be figuring out how to specifically get important news out there to young people, because first of all, Gen Z specifically, so the population born after 1996 is the largest segment of a population in the history of the world. We're 26% of the global population, but we're 46% of the total media audience. At the same time, we are growing up in this world where almost 90% of us have smartphones by the time we're 10. Our average attention span is 8 seconds long, and we're constantly on our phones on platforms that are oversaturated by content, right? And are now looking at news and consuming news even in ways where news outlets might have a few words or a few seconds of a clip to get our attention, but we're also growing up with this narrative of what is real news versus fake news. Who do you trust? Which media outlets do you trust? Like my younger sister, who's 15, gets all her news through Snapchat, right? Where it's one headline and one picture, and she still has to filter through and figure out which outlet to trust, right? So I think that there's an absolute need to figure out not only how to be able to reach young people in a very authentic way, but also to build this sort of trust with them in a way that they keep coming back to the same media outlet and following.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the problems for American Indians in this country is erasure, right? I mean, look at your textbooks when you've been growing up, except for, Thanksgiving maybe, you don't know anything about Indians, right? And so we really have to shift that conversation. And so what we've been doing in the Native community is trying to grow our own Native journalists, particularly the young voices, to be able to engage these new ways and systems of media, but also go at it from multiple angles. So I was just sharing earlier this morning, we met with the NBC diversity team, and the message to them was, when you're looking at a story on climate change or you're looking at a story on the border, you need to engage the Native people that are local to that area, because they're doing something, and they're doing something that have solutions that have utility for the rest of the world. And so really trying to change the way our voice is heard and seen and recognized.
Okay, great. I gather we've got time for, I don't know, at least one question, I was told, but from the audience. Who's the lucky lottery winner? Do you want to? Oh, okay, all right, there you go.
Hi there. My first question is for Ms. Ordway. And given the fact that you said you came from a background of poverty, and specifically white poverty, growing up in a trailer park, these things that have all these extreme stereotypes associated with them, etc. I wondered if you could speak a bit about what you think, how would you approach the disjuncture between accurate reporting, and then it seems like a lot of the media that the white underclass or working class consume, which essentially puts them against their own interests, demonizes minorities, because to me that seems like a real central problem, is the white working class and underclass has been culturally kind of co-opted by the right wing, and they're fed a lot of propaganda by the business sector. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on dealing with that problem? And then just one other quick question for, I forget your last name, I'm sorry.
Nadia, Xavier?
Far left of the panel.
Nadia?
Nadia, you say you work with a marketing company, and one of the companies you listed was it Pepsi, or how do you deal with evaluating the ethics of dealing with these certain companies? I mean, a lot of them just propagate the kind of inequalities that we're talking about.
So I focus in many ways on the corporate role in relation to the sort of things you're trying to work on. So do you want to start off, Denise?
Sure. I think if you're looking at, and I listen to these conversations in my family in terms of how they're engaging with media and messages. This is a really complex, fraught issue. And I don't mean to oversimplify it, but sometimes I think it's about, you've got a group of low-income people who are living a certain way, and they're viewing the media very much as not representing them, not understanding them, not being a part of their lives. And a lot of the messaging that appears in the media is very middle class norm. This is default middle class. And the people who become journalists tend to be middle class or from higher socioeconomic levels. So there's has been a rejection of what is showing up in the news and the newspaper and the broadcast. And I think it's just gotten much worse. There's just this absolute rejection of what they're seeing, and there's a reaction to the media, mainstream media. And I think that's why some of these other groups are becoming so popular. These other media organizations are becoming so popular.
So to answer your question, I mean, I think CSR and figuring out which companies to work with is always a pretty difficult decision. I mean, I learned on my work with Period, a few of our biggest corporate sponsors are like You by Kotex, Tampax, and Always, who give us millions of products every few months, right? But Procter & Gamble was a company that we really had to make a decision on working with, because historically they have been a company that's been named for withholding information about toxic shock syndrome and harmful ingredients in their products. But at the same time, I think that we recognize that in this space of how periods are brought up in mass media, there is a lot of influence that they have, and they do have a lot of resources, and that we could more than 500 times our impact by working with them, and we could work with them to change their narrative and change their practices as well. With Juve Consulting, it was sort of a similar decision, where it was something that we really grappled with, but at the end of the day, their goal was to figure out how to make their internal community a little bit more inclusive and more proactive on empowering younger employees to move up in mobility. And so depending on their goals, we worked with them on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm not, that's it. Okay, all right, well, so let me thank all the panelists very much again.
a quick announcement. Thank you all. We would obviously love to stay and listen to more conversations, but we're running a bit behind. So I just wanted to let you know you can please start making your way to the next sessions. We will be starting about 10 minutes late, so don't worry. But you've got from now until 10:35 when the sessions will all begin. If you've got any questions, please feel free to see us at the registration table. Thank you. And thank you all again. Thank you.